All right, we're going to go ahead and get started on our first session. So our first session is on framing the context and the history of the Colorado River. And I'm going to go ahead and just give a real quick, hog the microphone for a few minutes and just give a real quick overview and some context, and then turn things over to our moderator and expert panel here. Most of you know the river well, some of you are from elsewhere, but just to give some quick context, of course, you all know where you are. And we can go to the next slide here. There we go, perfect, thank you. Okay. Obviously, like I say, we all know where we are in the Colorado River. The slide here, and you'll see more from this in some of the presentations in the coming session, but you see the map on the right where you see the basin, and which we're just pointing out here is we have, of course, both the hydrologic basin, the area circled are some of the major demand areas that are outside the basin that receive water. Obviously not looking for you to make out the details of the other figure, but just begins to give you a sense of how much this is a complicated and plumbed system. And Daniel, certainly on our first panel, is one of the experts on that. Went the wrong way. There we go, okay. Obviously, the main thing that has been the big change, one of the reasons we're all here, is this steadily increasing demand, the line coming up, the highly variable supply, and of course the paradigm shift here was those two lines meeting. Again, something we'll hear more about in our next two sessions. Again, in terms of as we begin to get into the law of the river, another topic for our first session here, the upper basin, lower basin, what you just see is the figures of how the river allocation is split between upper and lower and Mexico, as well as within the basins, how it's divided between the states. The allocations, acre-foot allocations in the lower basin, the percentage allocations in the upper basin. Certainly the other major issue here is not just the 7 U.S. and 2 Mexican states, but the 28 tribes that are around the basin. And Pam, in our next session, not this one, but the next session, we'll be talking more about the tribal water study, and we'll begin to hear about some of the tribal issues related to the basin. Just wanted to give you a quick sense here of what you're looking at is on the left, it is on the right, get my directions here right, on the right are the upper basin states, and on the left are the lower basin states, and basically just showing to what degree are folks fully utilizing their supplies or not. The highlight that I would point out here is, as you look on the upper basin side, what you'll see is states by and large using significantly less than their allocation. And again, it's a percentage allocation, so we've taken that percentage, we've multiplied it by what would be a full river to turn it into a number. When you look to the lower basin side, what you see is pretty much full use. The other thing you'll see on the lower basin side, though, is in the last 2 years, significant decreases. This has been the intentional conservation that you'll hear more about that's been created to try to keep Lake Mead from going into shortage. To give you a little more feel for what's going on within the states, and this will become more relevant as we get into our third and fourth sessions this morning. So what you see here is just the water supplies by state. And so a couple points I'd make from this is one, as you can see that particularly for the lower basin states, about half groundwater use, significant groundwater use. And so we'll hear more about this in the fourth session, some of the programs with that. And then if you look at the percentages on the side there, you can see what percentage is Colorado River use of the water supply in the different states. And you can see by far Arizona is the most reliant on the Colorado River, with it being 40% of Arizona's supply, 10 to 15% for the other states listed, and even less for the states I didn't list. That's where the water's coming from. If we think about where the water's going, how's it getting used? Of course, the dominant factor here is throughout all the states, agriculture use is at least 2/3, and in some cases, the more rural states, much more than 2/3 of our water use. I'll skip over that one. I'll just end with this one. And again, in our second session, Kathy will be talking more to us about climate. The point I really wanted to make with this is using tree rings to construct going back. But it's this idea that climate's moving in cycles. If you're in the middle of a drought, it's not necessarily random what's going to happen next. Our droughts tend to run, dry and wet periods tend to run in these 10 and 30-year cycles, and 50-year cycles are not unknown. And we talked about when the compact was adopted. If you ask why the river's over-allocated, we allocated the river in a wet period. And we'll hear much more about this. So I'm going to stop there, and I will turn things over to our moderator, Alan Best. And Alan is a freelance journalist, and if you've got your landlines, he had one of the lead articles there talking about some of this deeper history of the Colorado River and did an awesome job on that. So Alan, thank you very much for that. And Alan has been a freelance journalist for a number of years and has contributed frequently to magazines such as Planning and Headwaters and now Landline. So keeping introductions short, with no further ado, let me turn things over to Alan, you and your panel.
Thank you, Jim. I've been writing about the Colorado River since 1977 at my first newspaper job in Kremling, Colorado, a small town along the Colorado River. This was the twin site of Mount Powell, named after John Wesley Powell, of course, and about 60 miles from the headwaters of the Colorado River in Rocky Mountain National Park. I've returned to writing about the Colorado River as frequently as opportunities present themselves, because many of the same reasons why most all of you are here today, I think, which is to say that the landscape is grand. It has these wonderful mountains. It has these canyons that this time of year start gurgling and thrashing with water. You have the enormous geography that's dependent upon the Colorado River. My grandfather raised sugar beets almost to Nebraska, based in part upon Colorado River water. And in wintertime, we eat our produce. Most of it comes from the lower Colorado River Basin around Yuma. And then there are, of course, the issues that have been mentioned several times today already: climate change, the issues about who gets what, where, when, and how do we move forward? How do we sustain ourselves? Well, the panel here that has been assembled is going to lay the platform for the discussion during the next day and a half. And as I thought about how to introduce them, I thought, well, I bet you everybody has rafted down the Grand Canyon. I have not. But I was wrong. We have one person that has rafted on the Grand. First on our lineup will be Sara Porterfield, who has a PhD from the University of Colorado, Boulder. And she, before that, was a river guide. She rafted more than 3,000 miles in the Colorado River Basin over the years. But she has not rafted the Grand yet. Next up will be Daniel Bunk, who is the Deputy Chief for the Boulder Canyon Operations Office in the lower Colorado River region, being based near Las Vegas, relatively close to the Grand Canyon. I said, surely Dan has rafted the Grand. But no. So you've done the math. The person who has is Ann Castle, who rafted the Grand 3 times when she was the Undersecretary of Water and Science in the Department of Interior, and she has rafted it 1 more time since. Starting out today, to give us a little historical perspective, will be Sara Porterfield, as well as an insight to what she learned as she went about writing her dissertation. Sara?
Should I use this or? Okay, great. I don't know how to use this, but I'll figure it out. Hi, thanks for having me here. It's really nice to escape. It was 36 degrees and raining when I left Denver this morning, and it's supposed to be snowing when I land there this afternoon, so I at least get to see the sunshine for a few hours today. So I'm going to talk about the history of the Colorado River Basin. I'm going to do this in 10 minutes. I'm currently teaching a whole semester on this, so please do ask me questions in the Q&A. And this is not going, I'm going to walk through a chronology, a bit of a timeline first, and then I'm going to offer some lessons that we can take away from the past 150 years of Colorado River Basin history. And then I'll offer some insights on how to use history and where to take this history and how it can help us make decisions now and into the future. And a couple words to say about this chronology that we'll walk through. It's not a complete timeline by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not going to walk through every event that ever happened in the basin. One, that would be impossible. Two, it certainly would be impossible in 10 minutes. And three, it would be pretty boring to just say that this happened and this happened and this happened. You all are journalists. You know what it means to tell stories, and that stories have a lot of power. So I've broken down the last 150 years of the basin's history into periods. I'm going to talk more about kind of the shapes and contours and thinking of those periods that form how we use, how we value, how we see the Colorado River Basin, how we see water, rather than this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm starting in 1869 with John Wesley Powell's first expedition down the Green and Colorado rivers. And I want to acknowledge that this 150 years of history is a very narrow slice of the history that's available to us in the Colorado River Basin. This is not talking about geological time, right, which is eons. This is not talking about indigenous history, which is millennia in this basin. But I think it's useful to focus on this 150 years because Powell's journey lets us, the 150th anniversary of his expedition this year, gives us an opportunity to look back on the past and evaluate what's happened in those 150 years. And it also, that span of time, gives us the system that we use today and the kind of development, the kinds of uses and values that we place on the river today. So we'll walk through 4 phases in the Colorado River Basin. How do I make it go forward?
The button's kind of in the middle.
In the middle, okay. Sorry, I'm a historian, I'm not. For a reason. Okay, great, thank you. I'm sorry that the top of this is cut off. But the first phase that I want to talk about is exploration and debate. That's the title that you can't quite see there. And this runs from 1869 with Powell's first expedition to 1902, ending with the National Reclamation Act. And these periods also, you're gonna see some overlap too in the years. Some will move back a little bit further, some will move a little bit further. There's going to be some overlap there to talk about how we've thought about the river. And this is a period that's characterized by American, and by that I mean generally white Anglo Euro-American men, right? Those are the folks that have had the power to make those decisions in the basin at that time, and that's changing today, but traditionally throughout the late 19th and then into the 20th century. And this is a time period when folks are going out into the region, into the basin, and figuring out, 1, what's there, and then 2, what to do with it, right? Powell's 1869 expedition is part of the what's there. This was the last great unknown section on the map. And then what to do with it, what to do with a region that seemed anomalous, an anomalously dry region in the midst of what people perceive to be an otherwise well-watered nation. And we can see this through John Wesley Powell's expedition. That's the second expedition there in that top right photo. Through Robert Brewster Stanton, who went out into an expedition from Green River, Utah, through the Grand Canyon to survey a river-level railroad route. Did not go well for him in the Grand Canyon. Spoiler alert if you're going to read that report. And then through the debates that happened in the later 19th century, including Powell's warnings to folks saying, hey, there's limits on this landscape. It's really dry. We need to rethink how we're going to settle this landscape, not using the Homestead Act, not using the public land survey system, and not believing blindly that rain follows the plow, as William Gilpin and other boosters advocated for. And then these kinds of debates, this culminates in large part in the National Irrigation Congress starting in 1891, then called the International Irrigation Congress, where people debated how best to irrigate, how best to settle. And then culminating in the National Reclamation Act in 1902. And then for our second phase is what I'll call laying the foundations, 1902 to 1948. This is where we get the legal, political foundations for the development, the infrastructure that would occur in the 20th century in the Colorado River Basin. This brings us up to 48 because that's when the Upper Basin Compact was figured out, was decided. And I think that's a useful framework to put on events like, let's see, the first projects for the Bureau of Reclamation, Roosevelt Dam, the Colorado River Compact, allocating water, right? The Fall Davis report, which said, hey, I think we should build a big dam at Boulder or Black Canyon, somewhere in that region. I think we should build an all-American canal. This period set the stage, those legal frameworks like the Colorado River Compact, like the Upper Basin Compact, like the Boulder Canyon Project Act, which authorized Hoover Dam, and said, hey, here's what we want to do in this basin. It laid out the groundwork, the frameworks, the legal frameworks, and the possibilities, the opportunities that people saw in the basin. It also is a reaction to what the Colorado River could do. There in the top right, you can see the 1905 to 1907 floods in the Imperial Valley that created what we have now as the Salton Sea. And people saw this destroy large swaths of agricultural land, irrigated land, losing a lot of money, and said, hey, we need to control this river. We need to put some constraints on it so that we can have irrigation, so that we can have economic prosperity. So this period up to the 1930s, 1940s is people saying, let's put in place the framework, the groundwork for the kinds of infrastructure, for the kinds of development that we want to see in the basin. And then the third phase, the era of big dams. Mark Reisner in Cadillac Desert, I'm sure many of you have read this book, calls this the GoGo Years, right? This is where we see the construction of all of the major infrastructure in the basin, right? Starting with Hoover Dam, which was finished in 1935, dedicated in 1936. Construction started in 1931, built pretty quickly, built in the midst of the Great Depression. Up through, what else do I have on here? Colorado Big Thompson project, bringing water across the Continental Divide to the Front Range. Boulder we get a bunch of our water from that. The All-American Canal was finished. Glen Canyon Dam is finished during this time. The Colorado River Storage Project was passed. The Colorado River Basin Project Act was passed in 1968, right? These are the GoGo years. And these are the times when this infrastructure, the faith in technology, the faith in building big projects, and the belief in those big projects really took hold of the American people. Not just in the Colorado River Basin, it also allowed the Bureau of Reclamation to take this technology overseas during the Cold War and using dams and other kinds of infrastructure that was developed in the United States as part of a winning hearts and minds strategy in the Cold War. And so this is when the Bureau of Reclamation gets known as this big dam building agency. And then the fourth period, you can see this overlap statewise with phase 3, right? 36 to 68, big dams getting built. The fourth one, 1956, I'm going to say up to the present, kind of a long period of time. And this is the what I'll call diversifying uses and stakeholders. And I'm going to start this in 1952, 1953, with the battle that was fought over Echo Park Dam up in Dinosaur National Monument. There was intense environmental and, I would argue, recreational opposition to this dam, and it motivated the public to see the rivers as spaces for recreation, as spaces for environmental values. And I think that started looking at the river as more than just a workhorse, more than just water for crops, more than just water for cities. Right, you can see that public opposition to large dam projects continues throughout this time period, right? It starts with Echo Park Dam. There's opposition to Glen Canyon Dam, even though that dam does eventually get built. And then strong opposition in the 1960s to proposed dams in the Grand Canyon. The Colorado River Basin Project Act was eventually passed without those in it, just like the Colorado River Storage Project Act was passed without Echo Park Dam in it, because of the efforts of recreationalists, environmentalists who didn't want to see dams, largely in national parks, but also on a river, right, that was used for environmental and for scenic, for recreational values. And then we start to see later in this period, I don't have all of the events obviously in here, but we start to see inclusion of more of uses that go beyond just environmental and recreational. We do start to see tribes considered more seriously in negotiations here. We start to see quality, 1973, the quality of water that's going to Mexico, how saline that is, taken into consideration. So this fourth period, I think, gives us a glimpse at where we have been moving since about the mid-20th century, seeing the river for more than just water for crops, water for municipalities. So what can we learn from this history? What does this list of dates and events and legislation and construction projects, what can this history tell us? What can this last 150 years help us to see? And these first, I'm going to suggest 3 lessons to take home from this last 150 years. And the first 2 are going to seem kind of contradictory to each other. That's because 2 of the principles that historians base our work on are change over time and continuity. right? These are two kind of seemingly opposing things, but they can be true at the same time. So what has stayed the same and what has changed over time? So the first lesson I think that we should take home from this is the system that we've created has been around for a long time, and it's very difficult to change. To return to Powell and to his ideas of the later 19th century, he's kind of the best known person who tried to change the system the way that he saw water developing in the late 19th century. But he's not the only one. George Perkins Marsh before him said that we should kind of pause in how we're doing this and think harder about it. And all through the later 19th century, even when prior appropriation law was in its infancy, a decade or less old, people were saying, hey, we can't let this become the law of the land. Largely folks who went overseas and studied other water systems and said, hey, they've got a better way of doing this. Maybe we should consider changing this system. We don't think this is going to work out very well. And Powell certainly is the best known example of this, right? I think everybody knows this watershed map. I realized today when I was writing some notes that this is the exam I gave my students last week. So they're learning about it too. They weren't very happy about learning about it, some of them. But that people have tried to change the system for a long time, but it's not going anywhere. The compact is not going anywhere, right? There isn't going to be a major overhaul. There hasn't been a major overhaul like, say, in the Murray-Darley Basin in Australia, right? So the system is here. It's been here for a long time. But that being said, nothing's set in stone. Colorado River Basin development and use can and will change. It has changed over time. We know that it's changed over time. We know that it can be flexible. We know that things that were were unheard of, say in 1890, were reality 20 or 30 years later, right? That these things, that the system can change, it can be flexible, and it can absorb changes to it. We can see this in things like Hoover Dam, right? In 1902, when the National Reclamation Act was written, nobody thought that a dam this big could be built, or nobody was necessarily doubting it. They just didn't consider building something this big, right? It took the construction of things like the Panama Canal, took the construction of things like big irrigation schemes in other parts of the world, as well as other dam construction projects like Roosevelt Dam on the Salt River, for folks to start to think in these bigger scales, right? And the other side of that we can see is the pulse flow here on the picture on the right? That 20-ish years ago, I don't know that many people would have considered that we would let water flow across the delta for environmental reasons, right? So we can see that the system does change. Things do change in the basin. And then for the third point, building on the second one, I think the thing that gives me the most hope and that I find the most interesting is the realization that beginning in the second half of the 20th century with that kind of diversifying uses and stakeholders phase that I identified, is this realization that the river is about a lot more than water for crops in cities, right? We have legislated environmental protections. We've legislated bringing more stakeholders to the table. We've legislated that recreation is an important part of how we use this water, how we value this water. And so I think that we can see through this timeline, through this kind of diversifying of uses, diversifying of stakeholders, we can trace how American values, environmental values, political values, cultural values have changed over this 150 years. And I think they're moving in a good direction. And then what else can we learn from this history to take it beyond those three lessons? I think that this is more about the discipline of history and how it can inform decision-making going forward. This river basin didn't just become a diverse place, right, full of all these different interests and uses and concerns and people, right? It didn't just become diverse in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's been diverse all along. And that recognizing that diversity throughout the whole of Colorado River Basin history is what the discipline of history helps us do. I had a conversation with Ken Burns last fall, and he made the point that the past is malleable. The past is flexible. We think about the past as being set in stone, that it's unchanging, that what happened in the past, we can't do anything about it, right? But It depends on what we give our attention to, what kinds of sources we look for, what kinds of perspectives we look for. And that the past is actually quite flexible. We might find a new diary entry from Abraham Lincoln tomorrow that gives us a new perspective on what he thought about the Civil War, right? And that changes the past for people, for journalists, for the public, for historians, certainly. And I think that this kind of flexibility, using history to tell better stories about the past, also helps us to do better public education, right? And it helps us to bring more voices to the table, to expand the cast of characters who are making decisions, who are involved in those negotiations, who are involved in those discussions, expands that cast of characters even more widely, and takes into account an even greater diversity of uses throughout the Colorado River Basin. A couple of examples of this. This map here on the top left is from my research into the transnational Colorado River Basin. How we think about the West, the American West, we think about the Colorado River Basin, I mentioned this earlier, as this kind of anomalous arid region within the rest of the United States that needed a different approach than, say, the East Coast. But it turns out that it was not just an American response to this dry region that created Hoover Dam, that created the kinds of structures that we have today. It was folks who intentionally went out in the late 19th century. This is from a map by George Davidson, who went to India in 1875, and said, hey, we need to learn from the British imperial government. They're doing some stuff that I think can work here. And that conversation, his observations and others who traveled abroad, they helped to shape the debate over water and the legal system that we have. You can see his ideas in the National Reclamation Act. Another way little bit different way to look at history, and I alluded to this briefly, is through recreation, the role of recreation and the power that boaters and recreationists have played in shaping public opinion about water, right? Getting out onto whitewater in rubber boats that were started out as surplus rubber boats from World War II, and saying, let's get some folks out onto the water, turned into a cultural shift that had people valuing water, valuing rivers, valuing the Colorado River Basin for its recreational opportunities, right? Folks at the time of Powell were like, that dude was crazy. He went down this river in a wooden boat that probably could have broken apart, right? We're not doing that. Glad he did that. But after World War II, boaters helped to introduce people to the Colorado River as a recreational space, and through that as a place that had great environmental value along with it, and to pay attention to those kinds of ecosystem changes. So that's the 30,000-foot quick view of Colorado River Basin history. And if you have questions about specific events at all that I kind of blew through in those first chronological slides, please do ask me in the Q&A. But I'll turn it back over to Alan.
Thank you, Sara. Next up will be Daniel Bunk. I neglected to mention that even though Dan has not rafted the Grand Canyon, he did backpack. He has backpacked in the Wind River Range, which is at the headwaters of the Green River, the largest tributary to the Colorado River. Dan?
Yeah, thanks for bailing me out there. I'm just an odd hydrologist who doesn't necessarily do a lot of stuff on the water, but I love water data and I love spending outside and doing a lot of outdoor activities on our public lands, but haven't rafted the Grand Canyon, but I plan to do that soon. So anyway, thanks for that introduction, Sara, and Jim as well. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, as the operator in the lower Colorado region, talk a little bit about operations. I'll touch on upper basin operations as well, as to try to set some more of this context that Sara and Jim have already started to set to help us with some of the discussion later on in the program. Oops, this See, I should have asked Sara to show me how to use this before I just did that. Okay, thanks. So I think most of us aware of the Colorado River Compact, which divided the upper and lower basins at Lee Ferry as well as allocated 7.5 million acre feet to each basin, and also the 1944 water treaty with Mexico, which allocated 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. So on the surface, I think you could say the upper and lower basins look similar, at least just with those numbers, but in fact, they're very different. If you're not aware already, I'll try to describe briefly. So in the upper basin, there's one large reservoir, Lake Powell, which has a capacity of about 24 million acre feet, and then three other system reservoir units, Flaming Gorge, the Aspinall unit, and Navajo. The upper basin is primarily a supply-driven basin where about 92% of the supply in the basin comes from the upper basin, and most of that comes from snowmelt runoff. And so that's why, starting in fall through this time of year, we're all eagerly tracking the snowpack in the upper Colorado River Basin, because we know if we have a good snowpack year like we've had this year, the runoff is going to be favorable. But Lake Powell, which is the largest reservoir in the upper basin, it's located on the terminus of the system. So it's not too many miles upstream of that compact point. And so that creates challenges for the upper basin in terms of how to manage their water supply. And then the other facilities that are upstream of Lake Powell, they operate based on their project purposes and RODs through adaptive management work groups, and that water eventually makes its way down to Lake Powell. In the lower basin, Lake Mead is at the top of the system, and so the water that gets stored in Lake Mead from releases through Powell and from intervening flows between Powell and Mead, that water can be regulated for deliveries to the lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico. And with that, as we're delivering water through all these facilities, we're generating hydropower, which is an important resource that comes out of making these deliveries for different purposes, from water deliveries to environmental concerns, as well as fish programs in particular in the upper basin. Of the 16.5 million acre feet allocated annually, there's about 13 to 14.5 million acre feet that's consumptively used each year. The reason why the full 16.5 isn't used is fully utilized is because the upper basin hasn't utilized its full 7.5 million acre feet. But the upper basin and Mexico have been taking delivery of their full allocations for quite some time now. So with 16 million acre feet of inflow each year, the system is operated on a very, very tight budget. It's over allocated, and as this drought has continued into 19, 20 years, essentially 2 decades, it's made it very challenging to continue to make water deliveries as required, but we've been able to. And so the storage, the 60 million acre feet of storage, which is about 4 times the annual inflow, has worked as designed, at least to this point. Of course, a continuation of the drought or a repeat of the first 5 years of the drought, which were the 5 driest years on record, would make things even more challenging. All right, I'm going to try to hit the right button. Yes. Okay. So this plot here, it's sort of another way of looking at Sara's timeline for sort of the key milestones in the law of the river. So on this plot, sort of shaded on the background, I have the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, starting from when Lake Mead first started filling in 1937, and then in 1963, and that's the darker shaded area on the plot. And then in 1963, Glen Canyon Dam was closed, and then we started filling Lake Powell, and so that's that lighter shaded portion of the plot. And so we've got the storage, the combined storage on the y-axis, and then we have sort of a timeline starting in 1937 on the x-axis. So a couple things that stand out is that after we began starting to fill Lake Powell, by about 1980, the system was essentially full, and then we went into some flood control years in the early 80s and mid 80s. We had a relative abundance of supply through the late 90s, but when the drought started in 2000, that supply was reduced in half within the first 5 years of the drought. And right now, the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead is at its lowest point it's been since Lake Powell initially started filling in the mid-1960s. And, that's really, in this 19 years of drought, we've had 4 years of above average inflow, but really only 1 year in 2011 where the inflow was significant enough to really replenish storage in both Powell and Mead. So it's been a tough 19 years or so hydrologically. So overlaying on that are some of these key law of the river components, and like Sara mentioned, sort of these framework and construction phase components of the law of the river, which are kind of in the purple color on the chart. But the parts that I'll be kind of talking about in a little bit more detail in the next few slides are the kind of teal color, starting with 1970 with the long-range operating criteria, and then continuing in 1999 and moving forward with the off-stream storage rule, interim surplus guidelines, the 2007 interim guidelines, and then these recent agreements that we've had with Mexico through Minute 319 and Minute 323. And it just so happens that these coincide with that decline in storage starting in 2000. And so I think, this drought, if anything positive that's come out of it, is it's really like brought stakeholders in the basin together to try to find these solutions that we've already discussed previously, and to try to develop new operational tools that fit within the law of the river, so that we have more tools moving forward if the drought were to continue. So this is a photo of Lake Mead, 2 photos of Lake Mead, one in 2000 before the drought started when Lake Mead was essentially full, and then a photo in 2016 when Lake Mead was at elevation 1072, which was the lowest it had been since the late 1930s. That white band around the lake in the photo taken in 2016, which would be the one that's on your right, that white band is approximately 140 feet or so in vertical elevation. So it's, it's striking enough in the photo. It's even more striking in person. But that essentially represents how much available capacity is in Lake Mead right now. During this 19-year drought, both Lake Powell and Lake Mead have reached their lowest levels, at least at one point, that they have been at since the drought started. For Lake Mead, it was in 2016 when it dropped down to about 37% capacity. For Lake Powell, it was following the first 5 years of the drought, where in the spring of 2005, it dropped down to 33% of capacity, it hadn't been that low since about 1964 or so. So the drought is, even though the lake levels do fluctuate, and at times Lake Mead has a little bit more water, at times Lake Powell has a little bit more water, they've both felt the effects of the drought significantly. So the 2007 interim guidelines was an agreement that was reached among the Department of Interior and the 7 basin states on a way to help manage the system in the face of the first 5 years of the drought. And so the guidelines are in place through 2026 for an interim period of about 20 years as a way to gain new operating experience. And I would say we definitely have gained quite a bit of operational experience since these were implemented in December of 2007. The guidelines allow for the coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead through a full range of elevations. Previously, there was Lake Powell would either release 8.23 million acre feet or it would equalize, which was a higher release. There wasn't any thing in those operating guidelines that said Powell could release more. I'm sorry, could release less than that 8.23. And in the lower basin, we had, at least at that point, surplus guidelines established. But with the drought, we realized that we needed the shortage criteria as well. And so in addition to the coordinated operations of Powell and Meade, there were lower basin shortage criteria implemented as part of the guidelines. And then another key piece of that is it established a banking mechanism called intentionally created surplus. And so that allowed water users with conservation, with ICS exhibits in place and then consistent with conservation plans to conserve water, bank that water in Lake Mead, and then that water could be delivered within the rules of the guidelines. So the guidelines do not include provisions for Mexico, but in particular, following the earthquake in 2010 in Mexicali Valley, we've been working really closely with Mexico on kind of sharing in things like shortage and surplus. And so Minute 319, it established that mechanism where Mexico also is sharing in shortage and surplus like the lower basin, and also established a mechanism for banking water in U.S. system reservoirs. And then as well as other key components like environmental components and different project components like the pulse flow that occurred in 2014. And a lot of those provisions were carried into Minute 323. And I don't necessarily want to dwell too much on this teacup diagram right now, but I just want to bring it up as a point of reference for my next plot, which I think is going to kind of continue on this idea of kind of this continued cooperation and collaboration in the basin. So this is a teacup diagram of Lake Mead key elevations, where it shows above elevation 1145, Lake Mead would operate in a surplus or flood control condition. In the range between elevation 1075 and 1145 is what we call the normal or ICS surplus condition. And then below 1075 are the three shortage levels as part of the 2007 guidelines and as part of Minute 323, which we define as low and high reservoir conditions for Mexico. And then within those bands, there's reductions of delivery that would occur then. And so we've been able to avert a lower basin shortage since about 2016 as a result of these banking strategies through ICS and through water deferred by Mexico under these recent minutes, as well as a pilot system conservation program and a lower basin drought MOU, and some other like voluntary contributions to Lake Mead. And so all these pieces together have added about 25 feet of water into Lake Mead. And so right now the elevation is currently, well, at the end of 2018, the elevation was about 1081. The elevation would have been closer to 1055 without these different programs in place. And you know, today's current elevation of 1090 would be about 25 feet or so lower. So, you know, it's really these kind of more recent operational agreements that, you know, we're not trying to redefine some of those key components of the law of the river, but trying to find solutions that we can implement operationally to kind of develop new tools that we could use in times, particularly like in times of drought that we've seen. I think we'll be talking a little bit more. I think my time has probably gone past my 10 minutes. So I apologize for that. I look forward to your questions at the Q&A session.
We plan a few minutes at the end of this session to be able to for your questions. But first we will be hearing from Ann with some of her observations.
Yeah, I was, can everybody hear me? I wanted to just make some observations about the trends that we see through the lens of Sara's history presentation and Dan's sort of operational history. I think some of them are obvious, but I think in this audience in particular, it might be useful to just think about the evolution in various different aspects of our operations. The first one is obvious. The trend toward more recognition of environmental values. Sara mentioned the Echo Park Dam controversy. We saw it there, and that altered the trajectory of Colorado River dam building and where the dams were located. We see it in the Grand Canyon Protection Act in 1992, trying to alter the operations of Glen Canyon Dam in a way that would preserve and maybe even improve the values in Grand Canyon National Park. We see it very prominently in the 2 minutes with Mexico, minute 319 and minute 323, that have environmental components that are one of the substantial foundations in both of those minutes. And I just observed that there was a wonderful event earlier this week on Tuesday with the publication of an op-ed in the Desert Sun signed by the representatives of 7 basin states and 7 environmental NGOs endorsing the DCP. That would have been unthinkable even as recently as 10 years ago. And so I think that's really a significant milestone for us to observe. I'd also say that Reclamation, Bureau of Reclamation, has followed that same trajectory in terms of increasing recognition of environmental values. Environmental values are part of the mission statement of Reclamation. And I used to think when I was at the Department of the Interior that Reclamation had gone from being a dam and power operator to a recognition that they were one of many co-managers of the ecosystems where their dams are located. They work with stakeholders like water users and power distributors like they always have, but they also work with the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the endangered species organizations and various community groups that are taking more and more interest and responsibility in how our rivers operate. And it's fine to have environmental values in your mission statement, but you may not know that Reclamation spends a significant amount of money every year on environmental restoration, river restoration. It varies in the administration that we're in, but somewhere between $150, $200 million a year out of $1 billion budget. So that's putting your money where your mouth is, and something that goes largely unrecognized, I would say. The role of tribes has increased. It is not as significant as it should be, and it's something that I think we will see further evolution of. But tribes are starting to be players in the discussions around operations in our basin. And I think you see that most prominently in the Arizona component of the drought contingency plan, where the Gila River Indian community and the Colorado River Indian tribes are key players and enabled Arizona to make the commitments that it has made. One other trend I think we're seeing as we bump up against the limits in our river basin is increasing tension between agricultural and municipal interests. And we haven't quite figured out how to deal with that. I think it's an area where we need to learn a lot more and figure out, maybe most importantly, what our values are. How much ag can we preserve, and what is the cost and the cost benefit of that preservation? do we need to think more about the value of crops and the value of ecosystem services that agriculture provides? And that's an area of evolution that that I don't think we needed to think about so much in the past as we do now. And then finally, the last trend I'd call out is the increasing public awareness of the importance of operations in the Colorado River system and the interconnectedness of all of the different states and water users that rely on that system. And that's because of you, because you have written stories that the public can understand. And I think that we're seeing more people being able to say in Colorado, the levels in Lake Mead matter to us, and I know that. And even though we have a good snowpack this year, that doesn't mean we're out of the woods, and that's because of good journalism. Now, I think we have a long way to go, because I think that the public understanding has gaps, but that is an area that has really allowed some of the political leaders and the state representatives to make the kind of commitments that they made in the DCP because they have public support.
Thank you, Ann. By the way, when we have questions, would you please go to the microphone to ask them, as this is being recorded? Bruce Babbitt, in his interview with Jim Holway in Landlines, talked about our view of the West as a land of infinite opportunity. But he went on to say that we are now discovering the limits. And Ann referenced limits also in her comments. What limits have we discovered and what seem like limits but really aren't? Ann?
Well, I think we're certainly seeing the limits of the supplies that are available to us. And we're seeing that upper limit is dropping because of the effects of climate change and warming temperatures. I think it's interesting. John Fleck and Eric Kuhn of the Colorado River District are writing a book about the science that underpinned all these various different agreements over time, including the 1922 Compact. And their thesis is that the scientists knew all along that we were sort of over-allocating the basin, that they knew what the limits were, even back 100 years ago. And I don't know how that all shakes out, but we're clearly in an era of limits now where I always think it's interesting, as Dan said, the storage in the basin, 60 million acre feet, is 4 times the annual flow. Really, if you look at the past few years, it's about 5 times the annual flow because our annual flow average has decreased. At the same time, we've got more demands because of population, but also because of the recognition of the need for in-stream flows and the need for recreational flows. And so the limits, I totally agree with Secretary Babbitt that those are shaping and driving the agreements that we are putting together now.
Dan?
And I just want to add to that, and I think the technical folks in the basin recognize that, which is one of the reasons why we've started using what's called a stress test hydrology for some of our modeling. We recognize this sort of a change in the flow regime, and so the stress test hydrology looks at starting in 1988 through the present, a different hydrologic record that's about 10% or less lower than that long-term average, consistent with what Ann mentioned. And so definitely that limit of supply is important.
Dan, a follow-up question from your presentation. At what capacity are we at now in our reservoir capacity? What's the percentage?
So right now, if you're just looking at Powell and Meade, which is about 80% or so of the total of that 60,000 acre feet, they're at about 40% capacity combined. If you look at the total system, which includes all the system reservoirs in the basin, it's about 47% of capacity.
And has it been higher for the total system capacity in the last 20 years?
Oh yeah.
Or, I mean, lower, excuse me.
No, this is the low, at least in terms of the combined storage of Powell and Meade. The last time Powell and Meade were the combined storage was this low was in the mid 1960s when Powell first started filling.
Sara, I'd like to know, who do you consider to be a real admirable figure in the Colorado River history that hasn't gotten the attention that they really deserve? And on the flip side of that, if you're willing to share, who do you think was an absolute skunk?
I think that there's a few people that I would highlight as folks that we haven't paid enough attention to. I took notes on your questions. I think that women in general have not been paid enough attention to. One of my colleagues at University of Oregon, Marcia Weisiger, is working on a book about how people have narrated their experience of the Colorado River and what it looks like when they write about it through the years. And she's done a lot of work with women who in the 30s and 40s and 50s were running rivers when men were the only ones getting attention for it. Elzada Clover and Lois Jotter ran the Green in the Colorado with Norm Nevels. And Nevels and Jotter or Clover was a botanist. It was her expedition to study the ecosystems in these canyonlands and to bring back, it was a scientific expedition. And Nevels took it over and named it, the Mexican, it was the Norm Nevels expedition, his company Mexican Hat Expeditions. And the women were made to wash the dishes and to pack the gear, and they were not given time for their scientific operations, which were, something that had a guy been doing it, they would have had time for that and recognition for that. Another woman who I don't know too much about, but I'm really curious about, is a woman named May Schnur. She was the acting commissioner of Reclamation under Elwood Meade from 1930 to 1936 off and on. And she ran Reclamation during that time. There's I think one master's thesis about her doctoral thesis, but she's not widely known. She is on Reclamation's website. I think another is Indigenous voices throughout history in the Colorado River Basin. How do we bring that into the kind of mainstream narrative that I laid out earlier? In terms of skunks, I don't think that there's anyone that I would call a skunk. There are a lot of people I'm really tired of hearing about in Colorado River history. Powell is one of them. And I know it's only March and his expedition anniversary is in May. He's a really valuable figure. And anyway, Powell, Dominy, largely dead white guys, right? That they get a lot of attention. And yeah, they've had a huge impact on the way that we think about the river system, the way that the river system was developed. Of course, they've played an important role. And we either need to make room for more stories, we need to make room for more stories, and we need to tell better stories about the people that get a lot of attention already. Powell's story is often told as he's this prophet of sustainability, and he, had we listened to him, we would have a happy ecosystem. That is not the case. He would have used every single last drop of water in the river. And so we need to think carefully about how we're using these figures and how we're remembering them. And who are we missing out on by focusing continually on these big figures whose names that we know? But we also need to understand what public perception has meant for the river.
Thank you. Just a few minutes, we'll begin taking questions from the audience. Matt Jenkins, in his article in Landlines, talked about the System Conservation Pilot Program. The question for whoever wants to answer it is, how far can that take us? Is that the answer?
Well, I'll take a shot at that, and then everybody else can chime in. I think the System Conservation Pilot Program, operated very, very successfully in what it was intended to do. It was a pilot program. And in the Upper Basin in particular, it was intended to test the feasibility of paying people to conserve, to fallow land temporarily, at its foundation to see if they could get enough interest. And it was successful in proving that farmers in the Upper Basin, and not just farmers, but some municipal and industrial users as well, were interested in conserving water, getting paid for it, for the benefit of the system. And that now has been discontinued in the Upper Basin, largely because it proved its point. But it will be the foundation for the demand management investigation that will be taking place as a result of the DCP commitments in the Upper Basin. And I think that, as Secretary Babbitt said, the Upper Basin situation is extraordinarily complicated in that our big reservoir is below us. And so the only way to create an insurance policy against curtailment of water rights in the Upper Basin is to create a pool, a bank of water in Lake Powell. And that's basically what the System Conservation Program was intended to test out. And we have a lot of things to work out in order to make that a viable program, but the SCPP pointed us in the direction of how to get there.
We have one question from the audience, so let's take that question.
So I thought I'd model this behavior, so if you have questions, just get up and stand in line by this thing, right? So I'm Mac from the Lincoln Institute. So I have two quick questions. One is, Dan, you showed that in some ways, part of the saving grace in the last few years for Lake Mead were a set of different contributions to the lake from various sources. But one big source was voluntary contributions, and I'm curious where they came from. Then the other thing is, we store a lot of water in the system behind dams, like in Lake Mead, Lake Powell, and other places. But another way that we store the water, and this is very confusing for me, is groundwater recharge. And so a lot of the allocation that comes to the lower basin, to a lot of these water districts, so they don't use their full allocation, they just pour it into the ground. And I wonder, has anybody kind of thought about whether or not recharging groundwater is an efficient and good way to store additional unused water as opposed to leaving it in Lake Mead or in Lake Powell for that matter? Because it seems to me that it might be inefficient to the extent that you have to use a lot of energy to get that water back out of the ground when you want to use it again. And if it's just sitting there in Lake Mead, you could use it on demand. So that wasn't just for you, Dan, but that was just two general questions. Thanks. Well,
I'll answer the first, or at least respond to the first question first. I think there's been a little bit of a shift in, the difference between leaving water in Lake Mead and storing water in the ground offstream. And I think that's reflected in some of the conservation and storage that's occurred over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, where, now we're, working on, expanding our programs through the System Conservation Program, through ICS banking in Lake Mead. And now there's more of a tendency to, rather than store the water off stream underground, but to conserve that water and store it in Lake Mead. We hope to continue to expand on those mechanisms to allow that to happen. Regarding your first question, which now I'm
voluntary contributions. Yeah.
Oh, so as part of a 2014 Lower Basin Drought Memorandum of Understanding, there was what we call protection volume goals that were put into place, where we had a goal of leaving about 740,000 acre feet of water in Lake Mead. And so there's different ways to do that. There's, create ICS, there's create system water, but there's another category that we kind of just labeled as voluntary contributions that that MOU sort of inspired that to happen, so to speak. Now, some of that water, if there's, with new ICS plans that might come into place in the future, might become ICS in the future. But right now, there is a pretty significant portion of water in Lake Mead under that sort of general category of voluntary contributions. These contributions came out of all 3 states, Nevada, Arizona, and California, all participated in that part of the program.
We have a question from Tony Davis.
Tony Davis from the Arizona Daily Star. Dan, so you said 25 feet. Lake Mead is 25 feet higher because of all these voluntary contributions and system conservation. So like in 3 of the last 5 years, like in 2015 you had the Miracle May, and in 2017 there was really extraordinary flow, and now this year you're having fairly high flows. How many feet do you think those 3 years of either good or freakish weather lifted Lake Mead compared to the 25 feet? Do you think it's more or less, or do you have a figure?
Well, I don't know if I have a figure, but I think, though, that reminds me that if I wasn't trying to get through my slides so that we could get to the Q&A, there was another component of that chart that I didn't mention, but I think relates to your question. And so another reason why the lower basin was able to avoid shortage for the last 4 years is because the hydrology has just been good enough where Lake Powell has had what's called a balancing release and has been able to release 9 million acre feet for the last 4 years and is projected to do so again this year. So it's really that combination of additional releases from Lake Powell due to hydrology that's just good enough, combined with these storage and conservation activities. But the idea is, though, is that we can't necessarily rely on things like a Miracle May, or I've heard this year called a fabulous February because it was the wettest February on record, and we were all rooting for Monster March right after it. So, I mean, those types of kind of unusual hydrologies might not occur again in the future, which is why we've been working on drought contingency planning.
And I have a question about the upper basin. If I'm not mistaken, Wyoming and Utah both have shares of the compact entitlements under the 1922 compact that have been developed, and Colorado may have a little bit. Why shouldn't they go ahead and develop? Isn't that what Delph Carpenter had in mind?
So I'm going to take advantage of the label of being a thinking person from Colorado. But I have to qualify any discussion of compact entitlement in the upper basin with a preface of talking about the delivery obligation that Secretary Babbitt referred to. And I just have to say that those 2 words, delivery obligation, make heads explode in the upper basin. And that's because there's a lot of debate about whether there is indeed a delivery obligation from the upper basin to the lower basin. And the compact itself says that the upper division states will not cause the flow of the river to be depleted below 75 million over 10 years. And so a lot of people in the upper basin call the obligation a non-depletion obligation. And it sounds like just semantic difference, but it's a real difference in that the debate is around whether there's a obligation to curtail water rights in the upper basin, or just to sort of float on the hydrology. Regardless of whether you call it a delivery obligation or a non-depletion obligation, it's clear that the compact allocates risk of volatility in supplies to the upper basin. And so the notion, and this was reflected on one of Jim Holway's slides, where the the sort of top dotted line was the theoretical allocation of 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin states. It's clear under the hydrology that we've been experiencing that that doesn't exist. It's just not there in the river. And Secretary Babbitt talked about this as well. When you acknowledge the upper basin's vulnerability to the hydrologic cycle, then it's clear that new development of water in the upper basin puts all the other diversions at risk and at greater risk. And so I think the decision that needs to be made in the upper basin is how much risk are we willing to take on, and what's the value of the proposed new development vis-a-vis the additional risk that that creates. And by the way, I should say, Secretary Babbitt also mentioned these sort of third rail issues that you just couldn't really talk about. This is one of those issues in the upper basin, the acknowledgement of a limit on the allocations and the ability of the upper basin to continue to take more water out of the river.
I have a question for Sara. Every story, of course, has to begin somewhere, and every book has to start somewhere. And we've had Colorado River books that start at Rocky Mountain National Park. They could logically start in the Wind River Range because it's actually longer than the main stem of the Colorado. You could start it with John Wesley Powell getting on the boat in Green River, Wyoming. But if you were going to do a movie, where would you set the initial scene?
I think that one place that really intrigues me, having never rafted the Grand Canyon, I've never been there, and when I go this fall, I'll be hiking into Phantom Ranch, but is Lee's Ferry. And I think that when you asked this question, what I thought about is this idea that a place can be thick, like there are thick places. It's some theorist in history. I'm really bad at theory, so I don't remember his name. But there are places that are thick in history. And that there's these layers of history, of events, of meaning that have built up over time. And I think Lee's Ferry is one of those places. I think the way that I kind of envision this in a movie would be like a time lapse showing the geological formation of Lee's Ferry. You know, it's this low place where you can cross the river, one of the few places you can in present-day Utah, Arizona region. Watching that geological history unfold, watching Ute, Hopi, Navajo move through that landscape and indigenous peoples before them. Watching John D. Lee, who was a participant leader of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, who was exiled by Brigham Young, go down to Lee's Ferry, be exiled there, and set up the ferry. And then to have that place as such an important location separating the upper and lower basin. And you know and then watch rafters come through. You know, first in a few wooden boats, and then a lot of rubber boats, and then going back to some wooden boats, starting with the dories in the 60s and the 70s. I think starting with Lee's Ferry, because it has become such an integral place, geologically, historically, legally, politically, would be a really fascinating place to start a story.
Thank you. We have 10 more minutes. We have one more question here.
Hi, I'm Brett Jaspers from KJZZ Radio, and you mentioned in your talk about gaps in public knowledge. I was wondering if you could identify the biggest, most glaring gaps.
Well, others may have different notions of that, but I think this idea of the upper basin entitlement is one of the most misunderstood areas, certainly among the general public. So I think I'd start with that.
Anyone else?
Dan, I have a question for you about system efficiencies. There was mention earlier of new tools. Has the Bureau figured out new efficiencies in operations of the lower Colorado River, in effect creating new water?
So one area where we've improved system efficiency was with the construction of Brock Reservoir down on the lower part of the system along the All-American Canal. So I'm not sure if everyone's aware of how the water moves through the system in the lower Colorado Basin, but it gets delivered through Hoover and Davis before it's temporarily stored in Lake Havasu, and then it gets released from Parker Dam down to most of the major irrigators on the lower Colorado system. Approximately 2/3 of the water that gets delivered in the lower Colorado gets delivered through Parker Dam. Well, it's about a 3-day travel time before the water gets from Parker to Imperial, and then it's another half a day to a day to get to Imperial Dam, another half a day to a day to get to Mexico's diversion at Morelos, and to Imperial Irrigation District. And so once that water is released, we have limited regulatory facilities downstream to capture any excesses or to provide additional water if there's any deficits as the water is moving down. And so since Brock Reservoir has been in place, the excess flows that are delivered to Mexico have decreased from about 70,000 acre feet per year on average to less than 10,000 acre feet. And so that's almost a foot of water in Lake Mead that gets saved each year. It's not just that. I mean, it's other new tools such as some of the modeling and data kind of management that we use. We're always improving that. We're always improving our customer stakeholder coordination along the river. But I think the combination of all those things have really helped to tighten up the lower part of the system.
Can I add on to my answer about gaps? I was just thinking of more. I think one of the gaps in our knowledge about the river is with respect to the role of tribes and tribal water and the role that that can play in overall management of the system. I think that the Colorado River Tribal Water Study that just came out in December is providing us with a foundation from which all of us can better understand the existing adjudicated tribal water rights, those that remain to be adjudicated, the quantity of unused water, and how significant that is in overall management. So I think that that's something that hasn't been written about a ton and that a lot of people could benefit from more knowledge about.
We have just a few minutes left. We have one question from the audience, and I have one final question.
Hi, I'm Brandon Loomis, formerly with the Arizona Republic. I work back east now. But, my question is for anyone, but it comes from what Ann was talking about earlier in regard to sort of the evolution in thinking or about environmental values on the river. And I'm wondering what you think is next in that evolution and what's possible or realistic in this age of limits. What can happen? What is there the political will for in terms of creating flows for the river as opposed to just for preventing a shortage?
I'm reminded in that question of a really interesting body of work that's going on right now to add on to the operational models that are used in the Colorado River system, add into those environmental markers like water temperature, water quality, sediment load. And the modeling that's done primarily by Reclamation and to some extent by the states is extraordinary. And it was the basis for the 2007 guidelines. It was the basis for the DCP. All sorts of hydrological scenarios are being tested, but it's mainly a water balance, which you would expect. I mean, that's kind of the way we've operated the system. A group led by Jack Schmidt at Utah State University is trying to sort of put another layer of components on top of that existing operational model that will allow us to just get information about how different operational scenarios impact flows through the Grand Canyon, minimum stream flows in various tributaries, things that just that information hasn't been available to decision makers before. And if you don't have the information available, then it's difficult to take that into account in making operational decisions. But because of the storage that we have in the system, and because the obligation, whether it's delivery or non-depletion from the upper basin to the lower basin, is an annual one, we have a lot of flexibility in the way we operate that we may not have taken advantage of as yet. And if we have information about environmental impacts and can run those scenarios and see how they come out, I think that will allow us to sort of take the next steps forward in incorporating environmental values into the operation of the system.
Final question, because we're 2 minutes away from our break. Fear or teamwork, which word better helps us understand how we got to where we are on the Colorado River? Fear or teamwork? Very short. I could talk about this for a half hour, I'm sure. 30 seconds.
I think that you have to understand both. If we write fear out of the equation and how much that has shaped how we think about this river, from fear of floods from the floods of 1905, 1907 in the Imperial Valley, fear of the river in its natural state, to fear of California taking all the water, right? You have to understand that in order to understand how this river system came to be in the way that it is. But to shape how that shaped public perception. But if we don't look for teamwork, if we don't acknowledge that teamwork has played a big role, this is borrowing from John Fleck's work, we're not going to keep doing it, right? If we don't acknowledge that it's already happened, it's hard to set a precedent for that continuing.
One final question. What do we as journalists most often get wrong about the Colorado River? Anybody want to comment?
I think I haven't, maybe not that interesting of a response, but I think one is just the confusion between how Powell operates on a water year basis and how Meade operates on a calendar year basis. I see that get swapped around a little bit, and how we set the operating condition for Powell and Meade based on an August projection of an upcoming January 1 condition. Sometimes there's confusion that if Meade dips below 1075 in the middle of the year, that would result in shortage, but it actually doesn't. So that's my kind of very dry operational response. But perhaps Sara and Ann have a more interesting response.
And if our other panelists wish to comment, you need to catch them at break time. We're out of time. Thank you.
Sorry.